All right. Thank you so much for being here. Last week, for those who were here, you'll remember that Pastor Allen came and he preached and he gave communion. And he talked about us being as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. And he reminded us that we're called to use our head and our heart as we go forth into the world. That we're called to use our discernment as well as our compassion, hand in hand. This week, we're going to look at the story of the prodigal son, one of the more famous parables of Jesus, found in Luke chapter 15, 11 through 32. So beginning with verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up, and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound.' And the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" This is, I think, as I already mentioned, one of the most famous parables of Jesus, one of the more famous stories in the Bible. And it's the third parable out of 3 that Jesus tells right in a row. And we just heard a minute ago when I read the scripture before we had our greeting time, those are the 2 parables that come right before this one. So these Pharisees are wondering why Jesus eats with sinners and with tax collectors. And we have those 2 parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And the point of those parables, they're relatively short, they're relatively simple. They show us that God is interested in going after the lost. Right? That Jesus came in order to find the 1 sheep out of 100. That he came to recover the 1 coin out of 10. God's not satisfied with 99 out of 100 sheep. He wants all 100. And then Jesus tells this parable. The parable of the prodigal son, as it's known. I think in keeping with the first 2, it probably should be called the parable of the lost son. And depending on which translation you read, you probably will see it called the lost son. Because prodigal means wasteful. I don't know how many of you know the word prodigal just in your... I don't use it in my daily life very often. But the son's wastefulness isn't particularly the issue at hand in this parable. So I think the parable of the lost son is perhaps a better fitting title to fit with the first 2 parables. But it begins with a man and his 2 sons. And the younger son asks his father to give him his inheritance, to split up the property in half and give him his half. Now, not only in the ancient world, but even today, I think we can recognize how ridiculously improper that was a thing to do. Imagine going to your parents and saying, "Can I have half of your stuff now? I really don't want to wait till you're dead. Could I have it now, please?" You can imagine that that's not really something you're supposed to do. It's definitely something dishonorable and certainly frustrating and disrespectful to a parent. The younger son is not just asking him to give him his inheritance early, he's asking him to give up a great portion of his livelihood, right? His property was his livelihood. So he's asking him to give up half of his livelihood and his wealth in order for his son to take it. But surprisingly, the father does what the son asks without saying anything about it. And then, as you can probably all see coming, the son gets up and takes all the money that his father gave him and heads off to another country. Just skips town and goes to live the high life. But partying it up every day isn't really the best path to financial success. So it doesn't take long before the son has just squandered away all of his money. And of course, he has the worst of luck, because it's not like he squanders all of his wealth, but then he can go live off the corn and the grains of the field, as a lot of people in the ancient world did. But he can't do that because there's a famine, we're told. He squanders away all of his wealth, and all of a sudden there's a huge famine. So a big, massive food shortage. And so he can't just live off the land either. So he's starving, and he's penniless. And so he's forced to take a job feeding pigs. He's so hungry that he's considering eating the pig slop. And I think a lot of you probably know this already, but in Jewish law, pigs are considered unclean animals. There's a reason why even today, Jews who eat kosher aren't allowed to have any pig products. Even since biblical times, the pig has been considered one of the most unclean of animals. So working as a pig feeder was a pretty degrading job at the time. You were messy, you were dirty, and you also were ritually unclean all of the time. So to eat the pig's food was a step beyond that. It's practically unthinkable. But that's the level of poverty that we're told he's at. He's not only taken a job that's the most degrading job for a Jew, but he's also considering eating the food of the pigs, which is the most degrading thing he could possibly do. So here's the young man that really not that long ago was living in very good comfort in his father's home, working his father's land. He had access to all of his father's wealth and riches whenever he needed it. But now he's taken that selfishly, and here he is degraded to the point of being the worst of the worst in the eyes of the Jews. And in that state of despair, he remembers life at his father's house. He remembers that his father's servants had plenty of food and a roof over their heads. They weren't living with the pigs. And so he recognizes for the first time just how low he's fallen, just how far he's gotten from where he was. And he makes the decision to head back home. But he doesn't have any hope that his father's going to take him back as a son to welcome him back home, because he's disgraced his father. And something we have to remember is something we lose a lot in the Western world, is that in the ancient Jewish world, honor was a big deal. And this son had dishonored his father and his whole family many, many times over. Because it was dishonorable to ask for the inheritance before he's dead. It was dishonorable to go live wildly and not care about how you're living your life. It was dishonorable to be working with unclean animals. There's so many ways that he had dishonored his father. He'd caused so much dishonor to his father that his father probably would have been considered even more dishonorable if he'd forgiven his son. It was the more honorable thing at this point to just jettison his son, pretend he doesn't exist, and move on. In an honor culture, it would have made way more sense, because the father would have become so dishonorable by welcoming the son back. So, he knows this. The son knows this. And he decides, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to beg to be a servant. Now again, imagine how low you have to feel to decide to go back and work for your own family as a servant. Because he'd have to see his father and his brother basically every day, and they'd treat him with scorn, or they would just ignore him, which might even be worse. But he had accepted that lot. He had recognized just how far he had fallen, just how far off the path he'd gone, and that it was his fault, that he had sinned and he'd fallen away, that he had gotten himself into this mess. And so he decides to go and become a servant. And when he comes home dejected, these are the thoughts that he's thinking. He knows that he has no chance of being accepted back. But his father sees him as he's still far off in the distance, and his father runs out to meet him. Now again, this is another one of those little things that we often miss, not being in an ancient culture, but an elderly man did not run anywhere in those days. Because it was traditional for everyone, and particularly men and older men, to wear tunics and robes that went down to your feet. And so you're going to trip if you run. You're not supposed to be running in those long robes. So in order to run anywhere, you have to hitch up your robe as you're running. You're going to look like a fool. You're going to look like an idiot if you're going to try to run in those big robes. So the son does not see this coming. The father runs up to him, embraces him, and the son is so confused that he tries to start his prepared speech. He's like, "Dad, I know I'm not worthy to be called your son. If you just..." And the father just shuts him up and tells the servants to bring him a robe and a tunic and a ring, which are all signs of favor and welcome back into the family. He tells them to kill the fattened calf to prepare a feast. The son had to be absolutely flabbergasted, surprised, because he came expecting to be treated with disgust and hostility. More than likely, he thought he would just be turned away. The father had no reason to accept him back as even a servant, let alone a son. But instead, his dad has ignored all social decorum, every rule about honor and dignity in that society, and he's accepted him back with open arms at a place at the table. And I think if the story had ended right there, it would still be a great story. That's sometimes I think maybe we hear the story end right there, and that's okay sometimes. Because it tells us a lot about God, even if we just stop there. Because God is represented, of course, by the Father in this story. And God knows that we have behaved dishonorably towards him, each and every one of us. And that we don't deserve to be called his children. And yet, all we have to do is recognize that and turn towards him even a little, and he welcomes us back with wide open arms. Not just waiting with open arms, but he runs towards us. So there are lessons about God's forgiveness, and there are lessons about repentance for us. If we want to be welcomed into the family of God, all we have to do is acknowledge our sin and head back home. We should learn to treat others like the Father treated his Son, by forgiving others, by pursuing others in forgiveness, rather than treating them with hostility. We learn that God is willing to accept us no matter what we've done. But, as you know, that's not the end of the story, because we still have the older brother to deal with. And so far, the older brother hasn't really been a player in the story. It's pretty safe to assume that he was upset when his younger brother decided to ask his father for their inheritance, for multiple reasons. One, because that was crazy dishonorable, really not cool. But also, as the older brother, technically in that culture, the inheritance was supposed to all go to him. And then it was sort of a social, cultural norm that he would then split it up equally with his brother. That was just the way things were. So technically the inheritance all belonged to him, and he was going to split it up. So the son is not just behaving rudely towards the father, but also towards his older brother by asking for the half of the inheritance that's not really his at all. But aside from that, he was also probably disturbed at how much shame that his younger brother brought on the family. He's the quiet one who stays at home and does what he's supposed to do, and his brother is off living wildly. And as he says, spending time with prostitutes and probably drinking like crazy, whatever he's doing. But he, the older brother, is solid. He's at home. He's doing the work that his father asks him to do. He's plugging along. He's quiet. He's honorable. And now he hears that his younger brother has come home, and that his father has prepared a feast for him. And he gets so angry that he refuses to come inside and see his brother. So his father comes out to him in the field and begs him to come inside and welcome his brother. But the older son's not having it. He just can't understand why his shameful brother, who's done so much damage to the family name and honor, is being welcomed with joy and with feasting, while he, the responsible one, never seems to get anything. And the father responds by reminding his son that everything that the father has is his. All he had to do was ask. That his son could have had anything he wanted at any time. But his brother had practically been dead, and now he's alive. He had been completely lost, and here he is, found. And Jesus doesn't tell us if the older brother comes inside after that. We don't know what happens to the older brother. I think it's meant to be open-ended like that, because we have to remember that Jesus is talking and telling these parables to Pharisees who are wondering why he's eating with sinners and tax collectors. Jesus is directing this section directly at them. The Pharisees have a choice. They can stay outside and stay angry that God is welcoming sinners, or they can rejoice at the return of the lost. So as we've talked about this story, I want to leave you with a question, which is, who do you identify with in the story? Do you identify with the younger son who sinned and needs forgiveness? Have you recognized your own sinfulness and you're hoping desperately that God will forgive you and welcome you home? You need to hear the words of this parable, that God welcomes you with open arms and is ready to celebrate, not to judge you. Or perhaps you identify as the older son who has to learn how to be gracious and welcoming. Maybe you struggle with jealousy or judgmental feelings or pride, and you need to hear the words of the Father begging you to rejoice with others and remember that you've been blessed with the great gifts of God and you're called to share them with everyone. Or, finally, maybe you identify with the Father. We tend to think of the Father as God, and that's true enough, but there are times in life when we have to be generous, despite the difficulties of giving away perhaps even half of what we own. And the Father was gracious in spite of dishonor. He was quick to forgive, ready to help his two sons reconcile with one another. Sometimes we're going to be called upon to give up much, to forgive much, and to help others forgive one another. So, as we end this evening, I invite you to reflect upon which person in the story you currently identify with. Maybe you can see ways that you're all of them. Maybe right now you're one, and in the past you've been another. But Jesus' words should have an impact on us as we recognize our place in this story. And each one of us has a place. So with that, I invite you to gather into groups of 2 or 3 or 4. Spend some time in prayer for one another. Maybe discuss who you identify with in the story. We're going to take 5 minutes, maybe a little longer, and I'll give you a warning before we're done, but just take a moment and reflect on this story, on its impact in your life, on the things that you need forgiveness for, on the ways that God can be working in your life. So please, gather into groups and let's spend some time in prayer.